Good morning. Today is September 28th, not September 25th as I announced to one of my earlier classes. Boy, was I off. Today we are talking about the scientific method. Specifically, we are going to be talking about the history of the scientific method. Our history starts a long, long time ago with this gentleman right here. This is Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher. And he lived about 400 BC. Aristotle is known as being, BC. Aristotle is known as being the father of science. He was the first to encourage folks to make observations about the natural world. And he believed things were true based on common sense. So, it is true that heavier things fall faster than light things. And it's also true that a feather and an apple fall at different rates. So that's common sense. Truth based on common sense. And that's where things stood for a long time. And then, sometime later, we have this gentleman. This is my not very good turban. This is Hassan. Ibn al-Haytham, and he was a Muslim mathematician. He lived in Cairo. About 1000 AD. So now it's been 400 years from Aristotle up to the birth of Christ, plus another 1,000 years. So he was around about 1400 years after Aristotle. In the Islamic countries, at the turn of the 1st century, they were having a kind of renaissance of their own for science. Al-Haytham is known as the father of optics. So almost 1,000 years ago, we have a scientist in Egypt who realizes that we see light because it is bouncing off of objects, and he even proved that it is our brain that is processing vision, not just our eyes. he studied optics by kind of using his own scientific method, where his first step was to state a question or a problem. He would then test it by doing experiments. He would interpret data. And draw conclusions using math. As I said, he was a mathematician. And as I said in an earlier lesson, math and science go hand in hand. And then finally, once he was sure about his the results of his tests, he would then publish it and make sure that the information was spread around so that more people knew. Our next gentleman on our way towards development of the scientific method. I know that some of you know who this gentleman is. He is wearing a little feather in his cap. This is Galileo. In years past, when I have given the scientific method lesson, I didn't quite realize how Eurocentric my little lesson about the scientific method was. And so I went back to find other scientists who have contributed to the scientific method, which is where I found out about Ibn al-Haytham. The time period, though, between the turn of the millennium and about 500 years later, there were a lot of wars that occurred between Catholic Europe and the nations of Islam, and a lot of the scientific information was lost or forgotten or forbidden to be used by the Catholic countries. We have a lot of having to literally reinvent the wheel by our European scientists. The reason why Galileo is of note is because he was one of the first scientists who looked at Aristotle's writing and decided to test if Aristotle's observations were true. So Galileo is going to use a set series of steps to revisit some of Aristotle's ideas to see if they were true. And about the same time, a little bit later, there was a gentleman in England. And his name was Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon is known as the father of the scientific method. And he came up with a series of steps where you first have your question. You form your hypothesis. You do an experiment. You make observations. You analyze your data, and then you draw a conclusion. And using this standard series of steps, to gain knowledge, or to test truth. Sir Francis Bacon revolutionized how we do science. And helped usher in the scientific revolution. This started with Copernicus, in the 1500s and went all the way through Sir Isaac Newton. And in that 100-year or so time period, we saw an explosion of scientific ideas. This is when algebra was created and calculus. We saw a revolution in chemistry, or rather a rediscovery of chemical properties that had been lost when the Muslim empires fell. We saw the discovery of electricity and magnetism. We saw ideas about gravity and planetary motion. And we even saw new information about cells and cell structure. All of these things came about because of the scientific method and coming up with a standard way of doing investigations and then explaining those investigations to others so that they could double check and make sure that they got the same answer.